Good evening, everybody. Tonight I'm going to read you an essay that I wrote originally in 2018 called Dark Past/Dark Future, a comparison of Blade Runner and The Big Sleep. My two favorite films are Blade Runner, a dystopian vision of future Los Angeles by British director Ridley Scott and written by David Hampton Fancher and David Peoples, and The Big Sleep, a classic Los Angeles noir based on a novel by Raymond Chandler written by Lee Brackett and Jules Furthman, directed by Howard Hawks. The two films share common themes, elements, and styles, and can be seen as directly complementary. Certainly, Howard Hawks' The Big Sleep, shot in 1944 and released in 1945, and again in 1946, and I'll explain that later, is the predecessor. It's clear that this seminal detective story planted certain seeds in the minds of Hampton Fancher, David Peoples, and even Philip K. Dick, the writer of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the novel that Blade Runner was based on. In The Big Sleep, private detective Philip Marlowe is hired by eccentric millionaire General Sternwood to clear his daughter Carmen of blackmail threats. Along the way, he finds Carmen's sister, Vivian Rutledge. Even though he's not searching for Sean, quote-unquote, Rusty Regan, everyone Marlowe encounters thinks he is, and this leads him deeper and deeper into trouble. By the end of the film, little of the mystery is actually revealed. It's hinted, vaguely, that Carmen Sternwood, a drug addict and alcoholic, may have killed Rusty Regan when he turned down her sexual advances. Gangster Eddie Mars learns of Carmen's misdeeds from his seedy tenant, pornographer and blackmailer Arthur Gwynne Geiger. The fact that Regan was seeing Eddie's platinum blonde wife on the side is a red herring, since Mars doesn't really seem to care much about his wife. The ending of The Big Sleep is ambiguous. Philip Marlowe and Vivian Rutledge, now lovers, are trapped by Mars's gunmen in Geiger's empty house. The cops are on their way, but will they make it in time? Blade Runner tells a darker, more sophisticated story, but with many of the same thematic elements. Rick Deckard is an ex-cop, a quote-unquote Blade Runner, hired to retire artificial humans called replicants. Replicants are illegal on Earth and can be shot on sight. Along the way, Deckard discovers a replicant who thinks she is human, Rachel, and falls in love with her. Tracking down and retiring the replicants for his cynical boss, Captain Bryant, Deckard discovers that humanity might not be what he thought it was, and what makes us human is more than merely the sum of our memories. The movie ends with Rachel and Deckard, now both hunted, trapped in an elevator. Their future is uncertain, and the hope of escape is unlikely. Both movies have experienced revival, restoration, and resurrection. In the early 90s, it was discovered that an early 1945 quote-unquote pre-release version of The Big Sleep existed. When that version was shown at an LA film festival, it garnered huge raves. The 1945 version was shorter and more intense than the 1946 film. In the pre-release version, the icy relationship between Vivian and Marlowe remains closer to the book. There is no racy dialogue in Eddie Mars' nightclub and no sexy bedroom scene at Sternwood Manor. At the Geiger murder scene, Marlowe does more detective work to discover the keys to Geiger's secret lockbox and discovers that the window in the kitchen has been jimmied. In the rigged quote-unquote holdup outside the casino, Vivian is less grateful and more cynical. There is no scene of Carmen lying naked in Marlowe's bed and kicking him out to explain his later comment. Carmen doesn't like when people say, "No, I've seen her that way." If that scene didn't happen, he hasn't seen her that way. The revival of Blade Runner has a longer and more convoluted history. In 1992, a quote-unquote director's cut surfaced in Los Angeles and San Francisco art theaters to rave reviews. It featured different music, cut scenes, and no voiceover dialogue. What was shown in reality was not a quote-unquote director's cut, but a rough quote-unquote work print of the film discovered in a vault. Though it ran for weeks, it was ultimately pulled and not released on video or DVD. Instead, Ridley Scott produced and re-released his own director's cut, which included an inserted quote-unquote unicorn dream sequence, which hinted that Deckard might be a replicant. The director's cut also dispensed with the voiceover narration and ended with Rachel and Deckard in the elevator, rather than the theatrical release, which had a kind of a tacked-on happy ending with them driving off into the sunset, quite literally. The director's cut garnered excellent critical reviews and ran for many months. But the re-release of Blade Runner was just the beginning of the film's resurrection. When it was released on videotape, an international cut included a few more scenes of violence not included in the theatrical release. Pris puts her fingers up Deckard's nose, and he shoots her 3 times, not 2 as in the theatrical release. In the scene where Roy Batty kills Tyrell, there's more blood and eye gouging and more direct implication of Sebastian's murder. A curious change in the international cut is that Batty says, "I want more life, father," not "I want more life, fucker." This gives the Batty-Tyrell relationship more depth and Batty more sympathy. He's not really a cold-blooded killer. He's an emotional child seeking answers from a distant, disinterested parent. Interestingly, there's a similar dialogue change in a pivotal scene in The Big Sleep. When Marlowe first meets General Sternwood in his greenhouse, the elderly man asks him if he likes orchids. He goes on to say that himself that he hates them, that, quote-unquote, their skin is too much like the skin of men, and their perfume has the rotten sweetness of a prostitute. That line is directly from the book. In the filmed version, a dubbed line is added so that General Sternwood now says, quote-unquote, the rotten sweetness of corruption. But there's a noticeable sound difference from the word sweetness to corruption that doesn't fit. And if you watch actor Charles Waldron's mouth, you can see him say the words a prostitute, even though his back is turned. Same with Rutger Hauer. Watch his mouth in both the versions. He says father, not fucker. So it seemed in 1992 that there were at least 3 separate versions of Blade Runner: the U.S. theatrical release, the international cut, and the director's cut. But what about the work print? Didn't that make 4? In an article in Video Watchdog, writer and film historian Phil Salmon indicated there might be as many as 7 separate versions, each with unique variations. There was, for example, the television broadcast version, which pared down the violence and cut the curse words. There was also the Criterion Laserdisc, which was considered the ultimate collector's edition. In addition, there were the Denver and Dallas sneak preview versions, each of which was a work print but contained slightly different scenes. The article became the basis of Salmon's book Future Noir, which chronicled Blade Runner in depth and gave a definitive view of the alternate versions, until 2007. For many years, starting in 2002, I frequented a website called Blade Runner the Movie. On that site, there were updates posted on what was then called the Blade Runner Special Edition. At the time, there were rumors that Ridley Scott was still not happy with the director's cut, which he felt he'd been rushed into issuing. The special edition would reincorporate recently discovered original footage, visual cleanup, and a remastered soundtrack, and some new footage. There would also be an extensive making of feature with many of the stars and writers, producers, lighting directors, art directors, and special effects crew. What other features would be included in the release were controversial and subject to change. Another effort was underway to petition Bud Yorkin and Jerry Perenchio, the film's producers, to allow the release of the quote-unquote work print, which they owned the rights to, along with all the other archival Blade Runner footage. There was a long, drawn-out legal battle. For nearly 5 years, it appeared that Yorkin and Perenchio were intractable, and no matter how much Ridley wanted to release his quote-unquote final cut, they weren't going to allow it. Finally, in 2006, rumors began to circulate that all the legal problems had been worked out and the quote-unquote special edition was on again. It was released in 2007 as Blade Runner the Final Cut in various versions, including HD and Blu-ray. I purchased the special 5-disc edition, which comes in a limited edition plastic quote-unquote Deckard briefcase, dummied up to look like the Voight Kampf machine, which includes a toy police spinner, an origami unicorn made out of plastic, a motion clip, and a letter from Ridley. All 5 versions of the movies, including the exclusive work print, plus full 9 hours of extras. Back to the comparison. In The Big Sleep, we follow the misadventures of Philip Marlowe, a jaded, wisecracking LA private eye who's drawn into danger by his growing passion for a shady woman, Vivian Rutledge. In Blade Runner, we follow the misadventures of Rick Deckard, a retired police detective who's drawn into a more direct examination of his own humanity as he falls for Rachel, a woman he knows is a replicant, even if she doesn't know it. Both relationships are steamy and uncertain. We don't know if Vivian is telling Marlowe the truth until near the end of the movie. We don't know if Rachel trusts Deckard until the final scenes. There are more similarities. In The Big Sleep, there are 6 main characters: Philip Marlowe, Vivian Rutledge, Carmen Sternwood, Eddie Mars, Mrs. Mars, and Joe Brody. In Blade Runner, the 6 main characters are Rick Deckard, Rachel, Batty, Pris, J.F. Sebastian, and Eldon Tyrell. In The Big Sleep, the minor characters include Harry Jones, Agnes Lozier, Captain Kronjaeger, Bernie Alls, Art Huck, Pete, Sidney, and District Attorney Wilde. In Blade Runner, the minor characters include Captain Holden, Captain Bryant, Holden, Gaff, Zora, Leon, Taffy Lewis, Abdul Ben Hassan, and Hannibal Chew. In The Big Sleep, there's a comical scene in which Marlowe, in order to get some information on the true nature of Arthur Gwyn Geiger's blackmail racket, enters a bookstore with his hat brim turned up, goofy glasses on his face, and uses a high, affected nasal voice. He inquires about rare books and learns that Agnes, the clerk, doesn't have any knowledge of them. This scene is given homage to in Blade Runner when Deckard meets Zora in her dressing room at Taffy Lewis's strip club, basically, affecting a high, nerdy voice and a geeky persona. He claims he's from the American Federation of Variety Artists Confidential Committee on Moral Abuses. He's there to check her dressing room for spy holes. Though she doesn't believe him, he does manage to charm her at least for a few minutes with his silly humor before she attempts to strangle him to death with his own tie. Maybe Agnes should have tried that. Both movies depart from the original books. In The Big Sleep, by Raymond Chandler, there is no love relationship between Philip Marlowe and Vivian Regan. His only passing love interest is Eddie Marsh's blonde wife, whom he refers to as Silverwig. The mystery of who killed chauffeur Owen Chadwick is not explained in either the book or the movie. In the book, Corman shoots Sean Rusty Regan on a gunnery range after he rejects her sexual advances. There is no such scene in the movie, only a vague reference in the final scene. Parenthetical here, I learned, since I wrote that article, that the scene was in fact written where she explains to Philip Marlowe what happened. But because Lauren Bacall's agent, Charles Feldman, thought that the Carmen Sternwood character was going to steal the thunder played by the beautiful Martha Vickers, was going to steal the thunder from Lauren Bacall, who he wanted to be the star of the movie. That scene was left on the cutting room floor. I don't know if it was actually shot or not, but I know that it was in fact scripted, because I've read it. Getting back, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a far cry from Blade Runner. In the book, Deckard is a bureaucratic cop whose job is to hunt down and quote-unquote retire androids. He's married, and his wife is addicted to a machine called a Penfield mood organ. Most of the time she loathes him unless she dials the mood organ to a different emotional setting. The novel posits that a final world war called World War Terminus has left the Earth irradiated and mostly abandoned. The radioactivity has also killed almost all animal life, while artificial animals, such as the electric sheep of the title, are readily available. Real animals are expensive and rare. Also, in the book, the character Pris is an android replica of Rachel Rosen, the daughter of Eldon Rosen, a prominent android manufacturer. She has a Nexus-type brain, almost indistinguishable from a real human brain, but has no empathy, as displayed in a scene where she tortures a spider, tearing off 4 of its limbs to prove it can, quote-unquote, do just fine with the remaining 4, not caring that she put this innocent creature in pain. The other major element of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep missing from the movie is the invented religion of Mercerism. The religion is based on the ability of human beings to emphasize with a false prophet named Johnny Mercer, who, like Sisyphus of the Greek myth, must struggle uphill against an eternal barrage of rocks. People have empathy boxes that are so real that if a rock hits Mercer, they're physically cut. But the androids prove that Mercer is really a drunk old actor and that all the scenes are faked in a film studio. The idea of Mercerism in the book is a way to establish the fact that androids have no empathy for others, which is a way that cops like Deckard detect them. There's also a bone marrow test and a blush response test known as Voight-Kampff, which measures the involuntary motions of the iris in response to questions to provoke an emotional response. This same test on the VK briefcase machine made its way into the movie, eliminating the need for the more elaborate mechanism of Mercerism. Leaving it out does not harm the movie, just as leaving out Chandler's lush descriptions of Los Angeles doesn't detract from The Big Sleep. Aside from plot similarities, there are common themes in the music, editing, art direction, special effects, lighting, cinematography, and even the costume design of both The Big Sleep and Blade Runner. Don't believe me? Watch the scene in which Marlowe is quote-unquote grilled by the fast-talking acerbic Lauren Bacall as Vivian in The Big Sleep, and Deckard's introduction to Rachel and the subsequent VK test. The quips, the dim lighting, even the dress Rachel is wearing are similar to The Big Sleep. Rather than drinking, she smokes and blows blue rings at Deckard, the perfect film noir femme fatale in her 1940s vintage dress and black stiletto heels. Howard Hawks' Los Angeles is a paradox. It's bright, rainy, sunny, full of sinister shadows. Ridley Scott's future Los Angeles is a rainy, overcrowded dystopia, a mostly empty city that still hides enough threats and menacing shadows, low lifes, dangers to make it both alluring and garish. The bright neon lamps advertise the good life off-world, where poor or sick residents stare up at the cruelties, unable to escape the maze of the city. The Bradbury Building, used to great effect by director Byron Haskin of Too Late for Tears and writer Harlan Ellison in the Outer Limits episode Demon with a Glass Hand, plays to both the climax and the denouement of Blade Runner, both a quote-unquote huddling place and a nightmare labyrinth, a city within a city. Just as the Khyber relentlessly stalked Trent in Demon with a Glass Hand, Batty relentlessly pursues Deckard through the upper stories of the Bradbury Building and even up onto the roof. There are no skyscrapers in the Big Sleep. Instead, we have other fixtures in the city: Geiger's bookstore, the Rampart Arms apartment where Joe Brody lives, Puss Walgreen's downtown insurance office, and Eddie Mars's suburban gambling den, all act as set pieces in the larger Dark City maze. The centerpiece is Arthur Gwynne Geiger's little gingerbread house in an illusory neighborhood. It's both the scene of the crime and the final refuge for Marlowe and Vivian, the same role played by Deckard's apartment with its Frank Lloyd Wright echoes in Blade Runner. The scene with the scene structure of the two films is remarkably similar as well. There are 32 chapters to The Big Sleep. There are 36 chapters in Blade Runner: The Final Cut, 35 in the director's cut, and 34 in the work print. Even the small scenes have a similar feel. For instance, compare Marlowe's flirtation with the librarian with Pris's seduction of J.F. Sebastian. Both are quote-unquote filler for larger plots and move the story along without really adding or detracting too much. The librarian helps Marlowe spot Geiger, and J.F. allows Batty to relocate Pris, and hence gives him access to Tyrell. Similarly, the casino scene where Vivian sings and is then quote-unquote mugged in an obvious attempt to throw Marlowe off the track is similar to Deckard's scene in Taffy Lewis's, where Taffy tells him he doesn't know about the snake scale he found in Leon's apartment. This leads to the fatal encounter with Zora, as played as deadly as any film noir quote-unquote bad girl by consummate actress Joanna Cassidy. Max Steiner's score for The Big Sleep is both subtle at times and heavy-handed at others. It wafts under Marlowe as he waits anxiously for Carmen to emerge from Arthur Gwynne Geiger's house on Laverne Terrace, then hammers us when the gunshots ring out. Similar, Vangelis' brilliant score for Blade Runner lures us in with a gorgeous opening sequence, then lulls us as Deckard eats his meager meal of noodles and fish at the White Dragon Bar. Both scores blend seamlessly with the action and the movement of the cinematography, tracking with dolly-like swirls, cuts, and swish pans. Edited to perfection, the scores of both films act as both guide and Greek chorus for the viewer, luring us into the darkest of the film noir mazes, Los Angeles. Harrison Ford's portrayal of Deckard is a perfect homage to Humphrey Bogart, even without the trench coat and fedora, which was dropped after Ford played Indiana Jones. He didn't want to wear a fedora in another film. He wisecracks, punches, stumbles, and investigates his way through a complex plot, every bit as tough and yet vulnerable as Bogart's Marlowe. Both characters get beat up a lot. Marlowe gets jumped in an alley, punched in the stomach by Art Huck, belted right in the face by Geiger's sidekick, and slapped by Vivian and Carmen. Deckard gets beaten up by Leon, crushed between Pris's thighs, his fingers broken by Roy Batty, and nearly strangled to death by Zora. Yet both characters seem to come out none the worse for wear. The scene of Bogart cleaning himself up at his sink after Mars's goons jump him in the alley near his office is nearly identical to Deckard cleaning himself up after Leon's attack in his own apartment. Lighting is perhaps the key element to what makes a movie quote-unquote a film noir, which literally means black film. Sidebar, that title was invented by Nino Frank, a French film critic who saw 4 American films which he thought all had a very similar feel to them. Those films were Double Indemnity, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Laura, and I can't remember what the fourth one was. I think Gilda. But he came up with that term too as a sequel to what were called série noire, which is black novels, which are the works of people like Georges Simenon, who wrote the Maigret novel series. The use of lighting, rays of sunlight, shadowy fluorescent light, and night-for-night scenes were all common in film noir, used to great effect in Big Sleep by cinematographer Sidney Hickox. The scene in Bernie Ol's office where the squares of light illuminate the square patterns on his office doors is a perfect example. Here's Marlowe, the round peg in a square hole, literally. The shadows Marlowe sees through the door in Puss Walgreen's office as Harry Jones is interrogated, then poisoned by wisecracking killer Canino, are wonderfully depicted, creating a kind of shadow world. The final scenes in Geiger's house, with the lights low to keep Marlowe's henchmen off kilter, works well and gives the scenes an added verisimilitude. Similarly, the late Jordan Cronenweth used light to maximum advantage to create mood and texture in Blade Runner. Look at the opening scene in Tyrell's Pyramid, with filtered light streaming in through wall-sized windows, then narrowing down to vertical columns as they turn opaque. This changes from a warm, welcoming place to a cold, sterile testing lab, as Deckard administers the Voight Kampff test to Rachel. All of the scenes in Deckard's apartment are shot in low light, using only flickering fluorescent bulbs and occasional rays of sunlight, filtered to show us just how small Deckard's home life is. His apartment is small, but Cronenweth's use of spare, boxy lighting makes it seem cramped and paranoid. Marlowe sits at home, up late at night, trying to crack the cipher code of Geiger's blackmail list. Deckard sits at home late at night, using his Esper machine, trying to figure out what neon pictures mean and why they're so precious to him. Marlowe sits in a nightclub run by a dangerous gangster, lured almost literally by the siren song of Vivian Rutledge, a dangerous woman who hasn't hypnotized like a mouse before a serpent. Deckard sits in a seedy strip joint in Chinatown, lured in by Zora, an even deadlier femme fatale, who has an artificial snake which is really Joanna Cassidy's own pet, and a deadly allure. The films are echoes, shadows, and ghosts of each other. So what does this comparison mean, ultimately? The idea that film noir has evolved into future noir is nothing new. I would argue that there were earlier future noir films than Blade Runner, such as Fritz Lang's seminal or masterpiece Metropolis, Terry Gilliam's Brazil, L.Q. Jones's brilliant adaptation of Harlan Ellison's Nebula Award-winning short story A Boy and His Dog, and Nicholas Roeg's dark version of Walter Tevis's The Man Who Fell to Earth. All of those films contain noir elements, including characters out of their depth, urban jungles, femme fatales, dark futures full of menace and woe, and twisted plots. But there seems to be a special link between my two favorite films. There are so many similarities between The Big Sleep and Blade Runner, they seem hard to dismiss as mere coincidence. Form in film history follows function. Great creators like Lang, who went on to direct several seminal film noirs, are often imitated by later directors and writers. Film noir themes, alienation, urban sprawl, loneliness, desperation, crime, lust, greed, and corruption are hardly new to science fiction. PKD's great unanswered questions, such as what makes us human and what is reality, only add dark flavor to Blade Runner. The same dark themes haunt The Big Sleep. Whether the question is who killed Rusty Regan or is Deckard a replicant, the journey to find those answers is just as alluring and fascinating. Ultimately, the answers prove elusive, forcing us to examine a lot of dark corners, even those in the human mind, to search for clues in Los Angeles, the city of broken dreams and nightmares. Each film is lovingly crafted, from lighting to editing, from sound design to costume design. Edith Head's gorgeous gowns for Lauren Bacall in The Big Sleep, to Sid Mead's futuristic taxis and flying spinner cars in Blade Runner. Each film creates a world rich in detail, steeped in myth, and so real you could reach out and touch it. There is no such address as Laverne Terrace, and believe me, I looked for it. But watching Bogart slump down in his 1936 Oldsmobile, you feel like it's real. There are no strange monoliths in downtown Los Angeles, but when you see the bicyclists race past, you feel like you're traveling with them. Each film is a masterpiece in its own right, but compared side by side, they show perhaps uniquely how adaptable the noir genre is and how vital it remains to film as a whole. As echoes, one past, one future, The Big Sleep and Blade Runner are remarkably complementary. Perhaps the urban alienation felt by Philip Marlowe in 1944 isn't so different than Deckard's in 2019. Both are underpaid, underappreciated detectives doing their best to navigate the maze of the city and somehow survive its vices and pitfalls intact. Both succeed, but at a price. Each ends with an uncertain future and a dangerous companion. I cannot say what draws me to watch The Big Sleep over and over again, or what keeps it fresh for me. Likewise, I can't pin down exactly why I think Blade Runner is one of the best science fiction films ever made. I only know that to me, they seem to be companions. I think if Philip Marlowe lived in 2019, he'd buy Deckard a drink and chat up Rachel with wisecracks and vice versa. I'm sure Deckard would find Vivian Regan just as much a mystery as Rachel Tyrell. like I said, I wrote that in 2018. I've found a few little insights since then that only further my idea that these two films are very complementary. Finding out that that scene was cut from The Big Sleep, where a very weary Carmen explains to Marlowe what really happened to Sean Rusty Regan. That she shot him, they put him in a water tank, and because Eddie Mars knew, he was blackmailing Vivian. The fact that that was cut kind of makes the movie a bit of a muddle. Just as when we see the inserted unicorn scene, and it's now the original unicorn scene, not the one cut out of Legend that was put into the director's cut, but the one that Ridley Scott actually shot for Blade Runner, which he found in a warehouse in New Jersey sometime around 2006. Gives us a kind of question mark. Well, is Decker replicant? If not, then how does Gaff know to leave an origami unicorn on his doorstep, when he leaves Rachel? And then that, of course, leads to the question, why didn't he, Gaff's a Blade Runner too, why didn't he kill Rachel? Why did he leave her alive? Is Gaff a replicant too? Does Gaff know that Decker's a replicant? And as implied in Blade Runner 2049, that he was supposed to fall in love with Rachel to produce his daughter? That's kind of an intriguing mystery that is added. Again, a very noirish element, and 2049 is very noir also in its colors palette, in its themes, in the very blank way that the character of Kay is portrayed, at least at first, until he starts to unravel, which again, that unraveling is very, very familiar to people with film art. Look how Fred McMurray, how, concise and wrapped up and whole he is at the beginning of Double Indemnity, and how he completely unravels by the end of it. So again, I hope you enjoyed these two comparisons, and if you do, please leave me a positive review or a like, and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.